Well, people like me are struggling with what to do with the religious nuns. You might have heard of these people. No, not the Little Sisters of the Poor, but those who are more and more frequently consider themselves to be sort of unaffiliated with religion. They've sort of just left it behind. Maybe they grew up as Christians. They grew up in the church. Their, mom and dad told them Bible stories, but as they got older, it just became less frequent, and before long, they're in college and they're reading Bart Ehrman books, or heaven forbid they go to Philosophy 101, and the philosophy teacher, he doesn't believe in God, and all of a sudden the worldview is kind of like, well, geez, what do I believe? And I think before long, not to speak for others, but, the busyness of life just interferes, and children come along, and man, it gets really hard to go back to church. But in America today, such a position is not as lonely as it used to be, as about 25% of Americans now consider themselves to be religiously non-affiliated, or the nuns. And these aren't just militant atheists per se, like my new friend David Smalley, who was on the show a little bit ago. But it's folks from a wide range of backgrounds and contexts. They're just not affiliated. So I have a very special guest, author of a Harper One published book, Grace Without God, Miss Katherine Ozment. I'm going to introduce her in just a moment, but first, you're listening to this. This is the digital side of KPFT, and so you might be listening right now at kpft.org or in your car on digital radio. And KPFT is like no other radio in Houston. Great news, great music, great Texas music. And shows like this, where we're free to have long-form conversations that look at some of the trends going on right now, and some of the changes in society right before our very eyes. It's okay if it's a little bit controversial. KPFT is not what I call a radio ghetto. There's a little bit of everything on KPFT for everybody. So this is, by the way, the Sin Boldly radio program. I'm Evan McClanahan. I'm the pastor over at First Evangelical Lutheran Church here in Houston, Texas. And this show is a look at Christian apologetics and, the Christian worldview and trends in society. So this book really is, I'm really looking forward to the conversation, because it's something I think about and encounter on a daily basis. I do want to say this is the first day of KPFT's Fall Fund Drive. It's our big one. We've got to raise $300,000 in the next 2, 3, 4, I think it's about 3 weeks. So let's get it done early. Go ahead and call in to KPFT. Go to kpft.org. You can become a member of KPFT. That gives you voting rights on the board and stuff like that for $25, merely $25. But we need about, I don't have my sheet in front of me, but we need about $150 a day for KPFT to go. Now, that's pretty cheap to have a full-fledged radio station with 2 channels. So do call into KPFT. The number is 713-526-5738, or go to kpft.org and do donate so we can get this fall pledge drive behind us. But now I am pleased to welcome onto the show Miss Katherine Ozment. She's an award-winning journalist and former senior editor at National Geographic. Her essays and articles have been widely published in such venues as the New York Times, National Geographic, and Salon. She lives in Chicago, my old neighborhood, near where I went to seminary in Hyde Park, with her husband and 3 children. And Katherine, are you there?
I'm here.
All right. Well, thank you so much again for joining me. I look forward to a kind of a long conversation. I read every word of your book. It's absolutely wonderfully written. I've got notes on virtually every page, but
wow.
we're going to have to skip around quite a bit, because there's so much to talk about. But let's just start with kind of your story in terms of why you wrote the book. Again, the name of it, I want to be sure to say it, Grace Without God, The Search for Meaning, Purpose, and Belonging in a Secular Age. You can find it on Amazon or other places easily. But talk about how you kind of came to write the book and what the book's about.
Sure. So I was raised in a patchwork of different Christian faiths. My mother was Presbyterian, and my father was Methodist. They were both from Arkansas. They met there. And at least on my mother's side, came from a very devout background. My grandmother was a big part of her church. She played piano. She had was just very invested in that community. My mother had Sunday sort of Bible study at her house as a teenager, in addition to Sunday school, and even went to Bob Jones University for a time.
Wow.
So I came from this pretty Southern, very religious background. But after my parents married, they moved to the Northeast, which is a decidedly less religious part of the country.
Yeah.
And I think things started to sort of fray a little bit. So in the 70s, sort of when I was growing up, my parents divorced, and church sort of fell by the wayside. It wasn't as huge a priority, although the patchwork continues. My father married an Episcopalian, and so my stepmother took us to church. And so I started going to that church also. And eventually moved back to Arkansas with my mom and went to an all-girls Catholic school. So you could see I had a lot of experiences with Christianity. It was very much sort of the air that I breathed, although nothing really specific that was constant. And so when I started to write this book was about 5 years ago. My son, our oldest child, was about 9. And we were living in Boston at the time. There was a Greek Orthodox church across the street from our house. And it was pretty late on a Friday night, around 9 or 10 o'clock. And he said, "Mom, you got to come look at this." And I came to the window, and we stood in silence and awe, really, watching the congregation walk up the street, all holding candles. And they were dressed in their nice clothes, and it was multi-generational grandparents and kids and young couples. And they stopped directly in front of our window. They had an ornate chariot-like contraption that was draped in beautiful flowers, and there was a baby doll inside, and a priest who then read a prayer to them, and they read back and forth for a little while and then went into the church. And my son said to me, "What was that?" after they left. And I said, "That was a ritual." It dawned on me that it must have been Good Friday, and so this was how the Greek Orthodox Church did it. And he said, "Well, why don't we do that?" And I said, "Because we're not Greek Orthodox." And he said, "What are we?" And I blurted out, "We're nothing," without really thinking of what that would sound like or what that meant. But the minute I heard it, I realized something had really come to a head for me, that I had that Christian background. I had married a man who was raised Jewish, had been bar mitzvahed. His father went to, Torah study at their synagogue. It was a big part of their life growing up. And we thought we would figure it out when we got married, that once we had kids, we'd find our religious community or flock. And clearly we hadn't. So my son was already 9 years old. He's pretty far along. And so in that moment, I realized I needed to look more closely at why this had happened to me and what it would mean for us as parents going forward. So that's really how the book began.
Yeah. A lot of it's interesting. Your patchwork experience is something that I hear a lot as well. Like, say, new members of our church, they grow. I have them over for dinner to get them, get to know them at our house and stuff like that. And it's maybe not quite that diverse, but it is interesting how in America, how common it is for people to sort of church shop. There's really not much denominational loyalty anymore, or anything like that. But yeah, I got the impression from your book that you are not on a tear per se against religion or anything in that vein. You're not necessarily on a kick to destroy the church or bring it to an end, or maybe we could talk about, does it have too much influence in the society and things like that. But generally, what you want to offer in this book is a kind of tour through different alternatives to sort of replacing some of the things that you would lose if you left the church. Is that about right?
Yeah, that's very accurate. And I think I'm trying to speak for a lot of people like me who didn't leave religion in a huff. They weren't angry about any one thing. They more just drifted away for a variety of reasons. And what I tried to do in the book was look at maybe what some of those reasons were. But they just realized that for them, religion was not going to be a priority anymore. And so, as you say, I'm not out to bash religion. In fact, I look really closely at what it does because I'm fascinated by it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'll say this. This is as I talk to people, and as I said, for example, and if I'm doing evangelism and I have conversations with people, our church is right across from a college, so I end up talking to a fair amount of people who are kind of in that, they're not sure what to believe and that sort of thing. I find the category of nun to be the most difficult to sort of engage with as a pastor. I mean, I'm a pastor. I'm a Lutheran. I have a worldview to sort of protect and defend, and I have to say I'm invested in it because it's what I do for a living. So I try to be, unbiased and so forth. But the nun position, if you will, I'd almost rather argue with a hardened atheist because, he kind of has his ground and I have mine. Or a Mormon, or even a Roman Catholic one where we might differ. But the kind of secular humanist, if you will, I get the impression there's not necessarily like any judgment coming from that end. So you're usually not looking for a debate or anything. You're basically looking for the things that organized religion offers well, but without the, I guess some might say, the kind of mythological baggage. So I actually worry about this movement quite a lot because it does kind of offer, I think, a much better and more attractive alternative to organized religion. I think a lot of people they just don't want to be called atheist. They don't want to just sort of like put themselves in that particular camp. So, but being a kind of a nun or a kind of secular humanist or something is generally, I think, a more attractive option. So actually, to me, it's an important conversation because the nuns kind of scare me, to be honest with you.
We're not scary.
I know. Like I said, the hardened atheist is in a certain sense a lot scarier, but let me ask you this, and then we're going to move kind of through the book, but because you've obviously thought about Christianity. I'm sure you thought about your childhood. You tell a wonderful story about when, is it your mother's father dies and there's a line of cars in front of the house?
Yeah. When my grandfather died, and my grandmother was driving home with her oldest son from the hospital in Texas. It was very late. He had died really suddenly after just being sick for like a week. And she was driving home, and she was just had this pit in her stomach about entering her home because she thought it would be dark and empty and quiet. And as she pulled up to the yard, they saw that all the lights in the house were on. It was the middle of the night. And there were people even standing in the yard, and people all over her house. And it was her church community. They had come to wait for her. And I read the story was written up later by a journalist. And I read that story and thought, wow, who would come for me if that happened? There's definitely this feeling of warmth and nostalgia about that kind of thing happening. And I think it's not just, non-religious people who maybe don't have those connections. I think our whole society has changed a lot from that time. That was in the 1950s. But yeah, I really do look at, and I should point out that atheists technically do fall under this nuns or unaffiliated umbrella. It's a big kind of messy tent, and we're all shoved into it because no one knows enough about us yet because it's kind of a new phenomenon. But I would say that my own perspective is one of a real interest about religion and not necessarily dismissive of it at all. I can see the benefits of it, not only in my grandmother's long ago experience, but in today's world.
Yeah. What is it that keeps you, would you say, because I'm I think about this only from a Christian perspective. What would you say is it that sort of keeps you from Christianity? Is it sort of like the difficulty in believing in miracles, or is it is the resurrection, which of course is a miracle, is that sort of a stumbling block? What would you say is the thing that it makes, even though you look at the beautiful ritual and you see the community, which by the way is not always perfect, I assure you, but what is it that keeps you from that?
It's a really good question. There's probably some personal things, like, I married a secular Jew, and so it's hard for us to find a place that welcomes both of us as we are. But I think if I'm just thinking about myself, on the occasions that I've been in a church, since sort of leaving the faith, it is the miracles, and it is some of the texts and the concepts within the Bible that I just feel a detachment from. I long to be moved by a minister's sermon, and so often I'm disappointed because it feels like it's couched in these really old terms, and it's not quite, and maybe that's just I haven't been to the right minister's church, but I find that there's something, once the Bible enters it, I feel like I get lost. I detach.
Yeah. Well, I've heard a lot of bad sermons too, and I'll say this about kind of raising kids. I have 2 kids; so they're 5 and 7, and kind of raising kids and thinking about how you were raised and how I was raised. There is a kind of like steadfastness that I think is actually, I mean, it's just really mandatory. I think for a child to sort of buy in. Like my parents divorced when I was 5. My mom was a music director of a Lutheran church, and every Sunday we went to church. I mean, I don't even remember missing for being sick or like vacation. I mean, I don't even, I'm sure we did, but it was one of those deals where it's like, now my 2 older brothers, well, they don't really go anymore, but for whatever reason, it stuck with me. But I mean, would you say that, like, do you put yourself in a category as a non-believer, as like a naturalist or a materialist or something like that? I mean, do you think about categories like that, kind of the more maybe philosophical categories of where you would sort of end up?
Yeah, it's funny. I was asked recently what category I fit in, and it's hard for me to answer. And I think that is part of the nun phenomenon, is that we resist labels and we resist joining things. But I definitely, I think I'm probably a naturalist. I believe that we are here in this sort of human form, and that this is all there is. I will say I'm an agnostic, so I don't know for sure. But I don't believe in God, or at least I don't feel that I know that there is a God or is not a God.
Yeah.
And so I can't arrange my life around that belief.
Right.
It would be an enormous amount of effort to arrange a life around something like that if it's just not a core thing that I feel,
Sure. Well, I asked that question, and then I promise after this we'll go straight into the book. But the reason I kind of ask it is because, I want to affirm 2 things about every nun, certainly yourself included, which would be that I believe that all people are made in the image of God. So I believe that all people are imbued really with a sense that there is more to nature. And as I read your book, I got that feeling a lot, that there was a kind of real there were times where there was a desire for there to be something more, but there was a kind of longing that pointed towards something more. And I would say I think that's the most natural thing in the world, because we're made in the image of God, and no matter what one's belief is, as a Christian I always affirm the absolute dignity and value of every human being, because they're made in the image of God. But the second thing would be, I think that, longing for things that maybe Francis Schaeffer, for example, would call sort of the upper story ways of thinking about life: meaning, purpose, belonging. Those are kind of the metaphysical questions. And I always, what I would affirm to every person, that those are things that within the natural world, I think that we can create for ourselves. I think as a Christian, and maybe specifically as a pastor, it's always a question of, but to what degree do they have final value apart from a supernatural worldview? And so that's kind of my kind of meta-narrative, metaphysical kind of question over the, well, I guess really any non-believer, which is, I think that we can all create, meaning and purpose to some degree. But what I love, and the reason that I believe Christianity, well, why I believe Christianity to be true is a different story, but maybe. But, what I do love about Christianity is that those things are also rooted in kind of transcendent reality. So that's kind of my sermon. Now I'm going to be quiet. But let's get into the book.
Yes.
So, of course, I was going to ask about page 2, which is your son asking, "What are we?" But that's how you've introduced it. So, I also wanted to say that I agree that because reading, well, I've already said that about our upbringing, how if we don't reinforce things with kids really again and again, I think it's often missed. Let me jump to page 17. You tell an interesting story where you're in Catholic school now. This is when you're in high school, and at the very top, there's a let's see, I guess it's a communion situation where, of course, Roman Catholics, have what's called closed communion, where only Roman Catholics can participate in the Lord's Supper, and you couldn't because I guess you weren't Catholic. And you write at the top of that page, you say, "It was my first lesson in the way religious tribes, through their beliefs and rituals, exclude others." And I wanted to ask you about that. I wanted to ask if that was one of those formative events that you, I mean, it must have been, if you remember it, where you kind of felt maybe left out, or maybe thought, well, gosh, all that's going on here is like one competing group versus another,
Yeah, it definitely remained in my mind. I don't remember a lot of, say, like my religion classes or things at school. But for some reason, that stuck out. It's funny because I had nuns teaching religion every day and lots of other things going on in that school. But that is the scene that came to mind when I was writing this book. And as I remember it, I do think I felt like, oh, I'm really not invited to participate in this. Do I belong here? Am I, aren't I, what is this that's keeping us apart?
Right. Am I subhuman or something? I mean.
Right. Yeah. So that was kind of a turnoff. And I was, a teenager. So of course I wanted to fit in and be like others. And I wasn't the only Protestant, girl at that school by any means, but I just remember that feeling of, oh, I guess we'll just stay on the bleachers, kind of like, the derelicts or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
It was a formative experience for sure.
Yeah, it's hard, because I've done the same thing. Like, generally my communion table is more open than a Roman Catholic's generally. Although a lot of priests have no idea if you're Roman Catholic or not, but in your situation, they did know that you weren't.
Right.
But like, I've had people say who are not baptized, come to the Lord's Supper, and I knew that they weren't baptized, and I said, I can't offer you communion because technically it's for Christians, it's for the baptized. That's kind of one of the requirements. It's really hard, and I really worry that they'll kind of give us a second shot, because it's one of those deals where to be a group and a tight-knit group and to have the community that bears fruit, there's a certain amount of boundary that needs to be around it. On the other hand, we would like to think that we're there for the whole world, and we know we put ourselves in a position to judge if we draw that boundary too tightly, but...
Right. Well, when I write about this really interesting body of research, which looks at the higher the cost of the religious ritual in terms of your own personal freedom, the more likely that group is to stick together for a longer time. So think of Hasidic Jews, for example. I mean, think of what they do to restrict sort of, the ways that they dress and the things that they have to practice. That is a really interesting element of religion and how religion has lasted for so long. So I can see how once you start saying, oh, well, anybody can come and you can just do whatever, suddenly you're going to have group members who are not really dedicated, and they're not going to do any of the, staying after to clean up, or, all they're what the social scientists call free riders. So I can definitely see that, but maybe that is going to be a struggle in some of these secular humanist groups that I looked at, because there really aren't costs. Everyone's welcome and everyone can come in. And it's really interesting to see how much you need that to keep the group together.
Yeah, no, I think that's it's, I mean, again, I find it interesting as a Christian kind of learning about these different groups. We have a secular church, if you will, that meets once a week. I think on Sunday morning. It's a former Lutheran pastor, someone I've had coffee with, and really really nice guy. And he left the church and left the faith, and kind of has this church going on, and I wonder about that, because I would say, I have this saying, and I say it at the church every now and then. True believers are the people that really move the world. And I really believe that. I think people that really believe in something and they believe it's absolutely true, and those are the people, whether on the right or the left, or the religious or the maybe not religious. I tend to think, in the course, the kind of the warp and woof of history, it's those true believers that are able to kind of move things. So I think that's one of the challenges I think the secular movement is going to face, is like, where do we ground, where do we ground our belief? But
but there is this really strong belief, say, in the separation of church and state that is motivating a lot of atheists and secular humanist groups. They really feel that there's too much religion in politics and too much politics in religion, and so they feel really motivated that shouldn't be the case. There's a lot of passion behind teaching evolution in schools and things like that. So I think that, as you say, belief can be defined differently.
Right.
But I think that really motivates people, because these groups really have been growing. I think you must be talking about the Houston Oasis.
Yep, absolutely.
Yep. And I mean, that has been a remarkably successful group. So I think there is something interesting in whether or not these groups will last the test of time. We'll see. But there is a lot of passion there.
Right. And probably most of the people that go there listen to KPFT. So, as the sort of, how shall we say, free thought, radio station in town.
Okay.
But, well, speaking of that, I want to jump to page 27, because there's an interesting quote from Mr. Putnam, whose first name I can't remember, but I know that...
Robert.
Yeah, Robert.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, he wrote Bowling Alone.
Yes, and that's one of those books that people have told me, you got to read Bowling Alone, man. You got to read Bowling Alone, and I haven't gotten to it. But there's a kind of on page 27, he says this, and this is you're interviewing him for the book, I guess. He says, just as the religious right were reacting against the 60s, your generation was reacting against Jerry Falwell. It's as if this generation said, if religion is just about homophobia and abortion, and if to be religious means to be a Republican, I'm out of here. That's not me.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, that, see, and as a pastor, I'm a pretty conservative guy, but, I'd like to think I've got a kind of broader worldview where I'm not equating, republicanism with Christianity and vice versa, but I can see how that happens.
Well, I think that his point, and I think I've heard it reinforced. I met a professor in Oregon, and he said, my students, meaning his college students, they don't know anything about religion. They come to me in Oregon as a very non-religious state, but he said, they come into my class, he's a religion sociologist, and he says, they think all of Christianity is the religious right, and that equals the whole array of possibilities of Christian churches and history and all of this. And that, the millennials are a lot more liberal leaning, and they are very open to LGBT rights and women's reproductive rights and things like that. And so when they hear in the news that, so-and-so conservative religious person is trying to make this happen, they just dismiss all of Christianity, if that's what it is. And I think Putnam's point and other social scientists have tried to make this point that that's part of this phenomenon, because the nuns are growing. The new report that came out last week from the Public Religion Research Institute showed that 25% of Americans are now unaffiliated and 39% of millennials. And I think a part of it is this sort of, not to sound crass, but this branding issue. I think there was a time when Christianity meant the teachings of Jesus, and now it means these political things. It's like they've been interwoven. And so it's hard for people to walk in those doors when they think that that's what it's all about.
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of hard. I mean, I'll give an example of how this might, like, a conversation might go in my own church. Like, I mean, several years ago, I was asked to be on a board. It's like a pro-life Lutheran group, and I was asked to be on the board. And I took that to my council, kind of my board of elders, and they said, well, we don't want to get involved in political conversations. And there happened to be another pastor at that particular meeting, and he said, well, we regard this not as a political issue, but a moral issue. But that said, it kind of made me reflect that I do think there was a time when the church wasn't involved in politics because there wasn't that kind of pressure for abortion before, say, 1973 wasn't much of a political issue. And I would say the same with the LGBTQ issues as well. But it's kind of like one of those deals where the church is now like, well, we have a moral presupposition and a scriptural, authority. So now it's in the world of politics. We can't ignore it. But yeah, I mean, I talked to a college student this week, and she came, and all she wanted to know is what our church thought about homosexuality. I mean, that was her only question. And, I tried to engage her in kind of a broader worldview conversation, and, kind of what would be her source of authority for determining, these sorts of things. But, in the end, yeah, I think it does put the church in a tough spot. I have to say it. I mean, that's kind of how I feel, but, I don't know. But, well, let me ask this, because, one of those kind of presuppositional questions for me that comes up in conversations like this is, so religious people are kind of the people with dogma, and I guess non-religious people are not. I tend to think that we're all going to have to default into some kind of dogma or some kind of creed. And I was really interested in your observations of the Glide Church in San Francisco, because this is the kind of church that tries to kind of avoid some of those, like, controversial pitfalls. And I mean, I've never heard of this church. What was it like going there?
That was such an interesting experience, because Glide it's almost like you're going to an event. It's this huge institution in San Francisco. They provide all kinds of social services in the community to homeless people, people who are addicted to drugs, after school programs. They're just really giving a lot to that city. And they made a conscious choice back in the 60s to remove the religious sort of accoutrement from the whole building. And so there's no cross. There's no Bibles. There's no minister with a white collar. They have this great, everyone goes to hear the gospel music because the singing is just fabulous. And they have speakers. So they had a speaker come and talk about the Black Lives Matter movement when I was there. And people get up and they sing, and there's a lot of energy in the room. But it didn't feel like religion to me. It was funny. I was struck by how I wasn't sure. Again, we were talking about the high cost of the rituals, keeping the group together. I don't live in San Francisco, and I was thinking, gosh, I wonder if I lived here, would I come to this again? Or would I just kind of come sometimes for the music, but not really fully participate or buy in? And it strikes me that as religions try to evolve to sort of meet the modern day where it is, they can often lose that thing that makes it special, makes it religion. I mean, religion is different than anything else that we have in the world. And so if you remove, literally take down the artifacts, but also the essence of what's different about it, you're kind of changing it into something else. And so it's a difficult situation because I think, the thing that people don't like about religion is exactly what makes it special.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. I mean, I we at our church, we still have a traditional liturgy. We just had a fire 4 years ago, and we got money for a new pipe organ, and doggone it, we got a new pipe organ. I mean, we don't have a rock band, we don't have screens, we sing hymns. I think 2 of our hymns on Sunday happen to be from the 16th century. They're not always that old, but we sing out of a hymnal. And it's very intentional, because I think that that people should feel like what they're experiencing in a worship space really is coming before a holy God, and this is a different kind of thing. And in the Bible, when people are confronted with the holiness of God, they're usually struck dumb, and they're usually struck, they're struck with fear, like the now I'm preaching, I'll make it real fast, but the very, very last sentence of the Gospel of Mark, in the probably the right reading, it's 16:8, chapter 16, verse 8, and it basically says that the women were afraid at the tomb, and then that's it. But there's some theory that actually what that's conveying is that they knew that they were in a holy place, and that their fear was the result of that kind of sense of holiness. So it seems to me that, not to say that incense makes a place holy, or, white collars make it holy. But
Right.
I really appreciated about your book that as you experienced things, it wasn't like you were saying, okay, I want now to sort of replace what was lost when I left religion, so anything will be good enough. Like you discerned things fairly, and when you would go to a service like this that has kind of intentionally tried to move away from, some of the trappings of religion. I mean, what you say about it, I'll read it. This is on like page 37. But as a religious experience, I couldn't locate its unifying center. It was life-giving and sustaining for thousands of people, but without the symbols, rituals, and teachings from Scripture, it was hard for me, at least, to grab hold of. And I've always kind of had this theory. It's like, well, look, if you're going to reject our church, I want you to reject it for all the right reasons, and so, but I thought that was a really interesting experience. So.
Yeah, it was. And it got me thinking, well, I don't think you can replace religion. I think that's almost, it just doesn't really make sense. Religion is religion, and there's nothing like it. And there's not going to be something just like it. And so sort of as I go through, as you read, and looked for different ways you could find some of the elements of it and create a full and complete life that sort of doesn't say, oh, religion's the norm and I need to have that. But let's think about this completely in a new, fresh way and look at what underneath that layer of, religion and religious language, what are people getting?
Right.
And what are the values underneath those labels and all that stuff that we use to divide each other? And how can we, whether religious or not, find it in a really genuine way?
Yeah. Well, let's talk about that, because I mean, I'm not making much progress here. I'm kind of slow, as you can tell. But kind of the second half of the book is a little bit more about maybe some of the more positive kind of, I won't say alternatives, but I mean, what was maybe the most striking group that you spent time with? I mean, you talk about, like, there was a group that spent time in a park. There was some more kind of new age groups and things like that. Does any, like, one in particular stick out?
Oh gosh, there were so many because they all did different things. But I will say that the one I felt, wow, if I lived in this town, I would do this, was the Hearth, which is a storytelling community in Ashland, Oregon. And they meet quarterly in a big group, but then they have, I think, satellite smaller meetings throughout the year. And it's actually run by a minister, but it's a completely secular endeavor. And what they do is he gets together, he gets about 8 volunteer storytellers and some local musicians. The night I went, they were from the high school. And they come and they stand on stage, and he'll offer a theme. I think I was there around Valentine's Day, so the theme was love. And these just regular, non-professional storytellers get up, and without any notes, they just sort of bare their soul to the audience. And there's the funny thing is, it meets in a synagogue because they were growing at such a rate. They had to find the biggest meeting room in town, and that one holds about 400 people. And they were literally not enough chairs. People were sitting on the backstage and lining up against the walls just to hear these people tell these really raw and honest stories. And it was such a sort of beautiful night. I don't use the word sacred very much unless you're talking about church, but it felt sacred. It felt like this real, genuine care and compassion was being sort of created in that room. And I think that's the goal of the organizer. And, the hope is that when everyone leaves that night, they have a greater sense of empathy for their neighbor. And maybe, the neighbor, they don't even know his name because of the way our society is now. But that if they see him in the store, they see someone else, they'll think, oh, we all have those stories. And so it really connected the people. Yeah. So I found that one very hopeful. And interestingly, the rabbi of that synagogue told me that, for one thing, it's more crowded than even at the high holidays when the hearth is in that room. But also that some of the people who were coming for the storytelling, it rekindled an interest in Judaism for them. So they started coming back to services. And some of the, people from the congregation that are excited to see, well, who's here, what are they doing tonight, are now very, big members of the storytelling community. That to me was really interesting and potentially the future, a place where we are sharing space with others, religious and non-religious, kind of coming together to sort of connect. I thought that was really hopeful.
Yeah. It's interesting. A couple times in your book, you would talk about kind of like one of the things you lose with the religious group is that kind of sense of community, where people come together. And I have to say, if pastors read that, they might go, well, it's not always quite as perfect as,
yeah.
What kind of makes it valuable really is how much is that we sort of forgive and come back to one another. Not that it's always perfect, I guess, but yeah, I mean, I certainly think that, people are created to be in community. And when people will say things like, well, I can be a Christian, but never go to church, I always think, no, you don't, I'm not sure you quite understand. Like you're made to be in community, and hey, even non-religious people, can see that. But let me ask you this, kind of looking forward, what do you think is the future of these kinds of movements, if you had to guess? And I want to read a quote that, I dog-eared the page, and it was from your conversation with Robert Putnam again. You probably know what I'm going to say, but
oh yeah,
you asked if there could be a church of the nuns, and you write, I leaned closer, pin poised. I thought maybe he was going to give me the clear-cut answer I was looking for. Instead, he shrugged and said, "We won't know for another 300 years."
Yeah.
And I just thought, wow, that really is the answer, though. And I think that if you look back on any group, you do need a really long time to kind of take a step back and say, look, is this viable? So what would you say, based on your variety of experiences, these kind of gatherings and so forth look like in the future?
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting what he said. And he had also said at one point, the religions we have today are sort of like the survival of the fittest. They are these finely honed machines that have lasted through time and perfected their rituals. And so there's a reason they're here, because many religions have died out along the way. And so what will be standing in 300 years from the groups that I saw? I found a lot of hope in the secular humanist community. I was part of one in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where I live. It's called the Humanist Hub. And one thing that they do really well is they offer an array of programs for all ages. And so they're really bringing in an entire family. They're bringing in kids, and they've got this learning lab. I think they call it the Big Questions Lab. And they've got them programmed, and while they're there, the parents are doing something. And sort of there's a place for everybody in that community. So that seemed really hopeful, because they're sort of trying to bring along the young too, which I'm sure as a pastor you know all about that. What I also found really interesting was secular Buddhism. And I went to a secular Buddhist retreat, and I also attended a secular Buddhist coming-of-age ritual in a different place. And it seems that this Eastern religion which is kind of booming, an interest in that is sort of booming in the United States, in part because it's more of a philosophy, but there is that connection through time to the past. And I think that's why it's so popular among people. I met a lot of people who left religion in these places, but they wanted something that was more tethered to a real sort of one of the original, philosophies or religions. They wanted to be connected that way. It sort of gave it a heft, but they didn't want to believe any of the supernatural stuff. So the secular version of Buddhism was kind of a great combination for that. Yeah. And that was another one where I felt like, wow, these could be my people too. I could fit in here.
Yeah. Well, one thing that there's a couple of times in the book where you would talk about kind of some of the benefits of religion. So I wanted to ask you this, like, do you think that, and I'm not sure I know the answer to this exactly, but do you think that religion is sort of something that people have created to sort of, for example, provide a moral framework, or to answer the question of life after death? I mean, you have a chapter on death, you have children, I have children. It's, it's one of the things, you can't help but think about as a parent is, your own death and that kind of alienation from your children and things like that. But like, do you think that religion was sort of something that man has sort of, I don't want to say invented, but it's a product of who he is to answer some of those questions? Or I guess the alternative, which would be where I would fall, that God has revealed himself, and it just so happens that, the answers of morality and life after death are answered. I mean, would you say that you kind of come with a sense that the good that religion offers is because it's what man has kind of brought to religion to answer those tough questions?
I do think that, and I think I take kind of a sociological approach in the book at looking at sort of when religions grew, when monotheistic religion came along, and I thought it was really interesting. A great book I read called Big God by a social scientist named Era Noren-Zion, and he talked about how when societies became really large and they stopped being these little hunter-gatherer tribes, that was when you saw the watchful God enter into people's belief systems. And it was a monitoring God. And the reason, he supposes in his book is that suddenly you don't know your neighbor and you're not really sure what they might do. And so with these larger societies, you have to have some way to keep everybody in line. And so the watchful God does that. And then everyone should, if someone's not behaving, they know that, maybe their neighbor doesn't see them, but God does. I thought that was a really interesting way to look at it. And then he goes on to show that once you get to a point where your secular institutions are really solid and providing a structure and dictating morals in a way with laws and courts and police, you have sort of climbed the ladder of religion, he says, and then you kick it away. And you have this society, and he looks at Sweden and Norway and all these, Scandinavian, where everything seems to be perfect, apparently, but no one is a believer. And so why did that happen? And that's his thesis, is that they climbed that ladder. We used religion in the past, but we maybe no longer need it as much to govern ourselves, to manage our relationships with one another.
Right. And of course, Norway and Sweden, in theory, are Lutheran countries, and
okay, right. So,
yeah.
And so they have that cultural background, and we all we come from this. But sort of, what do we do? Can we really kick away that ladder? And I think for a lot of non-religious people, secular humanists like me, I think we have kicked away the ladder, but we feel like we could still raise our kids right. And we have a moral framework set that we can just keep building on.
Yeah. I'll, like, on page 115, I'm kind of jumping around a little bit, but like you write, we're learning that we don't need God to be good. Parental influence matters, however, perhaps more than ever. And you talk about kind of like adolescence and altruism and things like that there. But I mean, I would agree. I kind of joked when David Smalley was on my show a few weeks ago, that, it was a joke that atheists, are less moral people than Christians. We could certainly find people who call themselves Christians and perform absolutely abominable, evil acts. And I'm sure that if you were my next door neighbor, it'd be great. I'm sure you are a great neighbor. You pay your taxes. You mow your yard. If I needed a couple of eggs to finish off my cake recipe, you'd be there, and and then very serious things in terms of grounding a sense of right and wrong in the lives of your children and all of that. I think the question, and I would say the reason that the latter always needs to be there is it's not that people without religion cannot be good. It's that in the kind of final analysis of things, how do we really define what is good? It's not to say the Bible is exhaustive in every moral manner, and there's actually a really interesting section in your book too, where you talk about how you wanted to read the Bible with, I believe it was your daughter.
Yes.
And then you get to some of the warfare in the Old Testament. It's like, yeesh, so it's like, let's read about the Greek goddesses, and again, one of the dividing lines, I think, in this is kind of that, one of the reasons why an atheist doesn't understand my worldview is because one of my presuppositions is this totally otherly holiness of God that puts him in a position where I'm not able to judge. And I kind of get the feeling from some atheists like they don't ever want to be in that position where they're not able to judge this totally other being who is in fact in judgment of them. But if a holy God is my presupposition, it is really the explanation then, which doesn't say I like the warfare in the Old Testament, but then the holy God is in a place to be in a place to take life, on by virtue of his holiness. But that said, I'm always happy when atheists affirm a similar worldview to me in terms of our moral outlook. I think the concern would be in the long run, in the big picture, is there sufficient sort of neutral ground? Because we have to decide what kind of a society we want to be, and what do we finally appeal to when half of us are non-believers and half of us are believers with totally different sources of authority. We might agree that it's good to, fund the fire department or something like that, but it definitely gets more complicated, I think, over time. So,
yeah, I think that is tricky, and I think that in the neighborhood where I live, for example, my kids go to school with Mormons and Muslims and Jews and Catholics, and there's just this whole mix, and they're all that's our neighborhood is this really diverse and lively place.
Yeah.
Lots of religions. I mean, there's just a row of churches just a block from where I live. And yet there is this undergirding of, I don't know if it's secular humanism or community service or an acceptance of diversity in my neighborhood that makes it all work. And I think, I don't know exactly know how to describe it. It's just we understand that we have different beliefs, but our values of we want to help out, we want to help each other, we want our kids to be strong and smart and safe, and it just we get along, we're great friends, and
Right.
So I think there is a way. I don't know how that quite happened where I live,
Yeah.
but I just know that when I moved here, it was one of the first things I noticed was how tight the communal bond in this really diverse community.
Yep. Yeah. When I went to school there, it was, there's definitely a sense. I mean, I would say that's one of the real benefits, I think, of, say, postmodernism and the millennials is that they don't have this this baggage of bigotry. They're very open-minded. I would say that and I hate to even say there's a downside to it, but there comes, from my point of view, like, it's hard to get someone to get to that point of saying, well, do you believe that this is true or not? And I find that, say, and your average, like, 20-year-old, like, they're very open and they're loving and they're not racist, which thank God for that, but it's like, but they'll hold mutually exclusive beliefs at the same time. It's like, well, I believe in God, but I think it could be Islam or it could be Christianity. And I would say, well, actually, those things are necessarily mutually exclusive. Not to say that, I don't have Muslim neighbors and good relationships, but yeah.
No, I know what you mean. And I find it, I think it can be easily, go off on some crazy tangent. But, I know in my own exploration of all of these issues, I've come to the conclusion that I'm very comfortable in uncertainty.
Yep.
And maybe that's a dangerous place for everyone in a society to live, but I'm very comfortable not knowing for sure, for example, if there is or isn't a God. Yeah. I just will sort of allow that to become apparent to me later if there is one. But that the idea of living in that sort of gray area is actually where I want to be. And that I want to, and yet I still feel I have a strong sense of morals. When my kids come to me with a question, I have a way of like talking them through it. And maybe it's that, maybe my orientation is sort of the scientific method of let's look at the evidence and let's walk through some logical steps of how we would approach this problem. But that I don't feel I need, a handed down set of laws to guide me in raising these good kids.
Yeah. Well, let's kind of, I want to say two things. One is I wanted to get to, kind of the end where, and you kind of just got there, but because amazingly the hour's just kind of flown by. But you're right on near the end of the book. As we make our way forward without religion, I still don't have answers to all the big questions, but I'm starting to see that becoming more comfortable holding the question is the only way that makes sense to me. I turn the questions over and over again until they are like smooth, solid stones. So, I mean, that's kind of after this journey, because we skipped over so much stuff in the book. I mean, so many places and people you visited with. But that's kind of where you end up, right? Like I still have some questions, but I'm okay to continue to think about them, ask them, etc.
Yeah, and I think that the place I was in 3 years ago when I started the book was I wasn't even asking the questions, or maybe I was, but I wasn't really fessing up to that. And so the idea is to just be open to, conversations like this. I now talk to everyone I know about religion. You're not supposed to do that.
You're that person at the party.
But I find that it really gets to the heart of what people care about, and I find it the most fascinating subject.
Yeah. Well, I certainly appreciate it. I tell you what, I hope that a sequel is in the works. And if you'd like to come to Houston and consult with me, just let me know.
Okay.
But I would be really interested in well, of course I would say this as a pastor, but I would be really interested in your journalistic, kind of investigative skills. And maybe taking, I don't know, maybe investigating Christianity sort of in depth. There's a kind of pop apologist, Lee Strobel, and I'm not a big fan of his books, although he's in Houston now, and I should be, because I should probably beg him to come on the show or something. But he was a journalist. I don't know, I don't know. I don't know what he did. I don't know what kind of journalist he was, but he set out to prove Christianity wasn't true and came to be convinced that the resurrection was true. And it would be really interesting if you did something similar, but from the position where you're at, and given the kind of writer that you are and the kind of thinker that you are, I would find that interesting.
Well, you may be interested to know that I go to church once a month.
Ah, very good.
And I go to a Taize, T-A-I-Z-E service.
Yeah.
You know about these? And it's really simple. It's not your traditional church service, but they're a block away from my house. Every first Friday, they have this really just simple 1 hour long. You go in and light a candle and you sing. And I really, I'm not really believing anything I'm singing. But I enjoy being there, and I enjoy being in that space, in that building with this beautiful dome and the stained glass windows. And it's just sort of enough for me. But maybe it's grounds for further exploration.
Yeah, again, I have to say what I think that, I mean, I don't think that Christianity is like one religion among others. I actually think it is the fulfillment of Revelation, from the one true God, and it spans 1,500 years, and the Bible is 50 different authors, or maybe 40 different authors, and yet it's this consistently, this consistent witness to the same God. And that's when I have my own doubts, and when I think, God, this stuff just is this just can't be true. I mean, and I do have those thoughts. I'm a rational human being. I mean, I can't help but think it. That's what I always come back to, is like, no, this is a consistent revelation from God again and again. And that's what keeps it. So hopefully in that Taizé service, I've done Taizé at my church as well. I hope you're hearing that words, and, but as a pastor, I would be a pretty lousy pastor if I didn't hope that it would, sort of, resonate with you. So,
right.
And it's ironic too. I believe you're in like the most religious area, like the second most religious area in the world, because there's like 9 seminaries in Hyde Park. So.
Yeah, it's really funny. And they're mixed in with all these scientists, and everyone's just kind of hanging out.
Right.
And it's great. All these atheists and religious people, and it seems to get along just fine.
Yeah. Well, listen, Katherine, thank you so much for your time. I'll email you when the podcast is out, and if you want to share the link on Facebook or something, that'd be great. But anyway, thank you again so much for your time, and we'll catch up with you again soon. Okay?
Fabulous. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you. Talk later.
Okay.
Bye-bye. Okay. Well, that was so nice of her. I'm late in getting off the air, so I'm going to go off the air right now. KPFT folks, thanks so much for listening. Catch you next week. All right, I'm off the air, so I'm just going to go one more minute here to wrap things up. I really appreciate Miss Ozment's time. I have to say Miss Ozment, even though we're almost the same age. But really appreciate her time. And I wanted to have that conversation because, again, as a Christian pastor, kind of the nuns... the nuns are one of those groups that can be a little bit tough to, I think, know how to relate to. So, well, friends, I'm going to go. Until next week, may you have the peace that passes all understanding. See ya. Spines are tingling, out of patience, delirious insistence might as well instead.